And just to give a little bit of context for why we're here and who's not here, this is a coalition of 20 plus community organizations across California, and we wanted to invite the bid committee and people from the mayor's office to be here this evening to hear our concerns, to address the questions that we've been asking, the things that they've been unable to do so. And we've got a chair for Mayor Garcetti. It is auspiciously empty. And members of the bid committee told us yesterday that they were not going to be attending this, despite the fact that they have said that they want a dialogue with us on these issues. We prefer to have a public dialogue. They prefer to meet with us in private, and that's not acceptable to us as part of this process. And that's why this forum is here tonight. That's why this forum is public, and that's why we are here and they are not. So without further ado, I'd love to welcome up our first panel discussion tonight. Our first subject we're going to be covering tonight is housing and displacement. If you have any questions for any of our panelists, please write them down, pass them off to one of our volunteers, and we'll make sure that they are addressed to the best of our ability during this first panel discussion. So if everyone from the housing and displacement panel, Nancy Popp, Joe Donlin, Damien Goodmon, Marques Vestal, and either Pete White or Linus Shentu could please come up to the dais, and we'll get our first conversation going. So as folks are getting seated, we're just going to have everybody introduce themselves very quickly. Because we're short on time, we want to do as much discussion as possible. I would just ask that each of our panelists, in introducing yourselves, please just tell us your name, what organization you're with, and just try to keep the bio real tight, and then we'll get into the real meat of the discussion.
Hi, my name is Nancy Popp. I am a member of the LA Tenants Union, and I'm a fourth generation LA native, and I've been working here around displacement for probably close to 10 years.
Pete White, Los Angeles Community Action Network, a South Central Los Angeles native as well.
Damien Goodmon of the Crenshaw Subway Coalition. My family's been in South Central for over 100 years, and I'm not moving.
Hi everyone, Joe Donlin with SAJE Strategic Actions for a Just Economy. Glad you all could be here with us at our home.
My name is Marques, I'm a UCLA student, but I also organize with a freedom school called the Undercommons. Also LA native.
Great, thank you so much. So the first thing that we want to talk about with regards to housing and displacement, oftentimes the bid committee likes to talk about how these games won't displace people because there isn't going to be any new stadiums or major infrastructure built for the games. I wanted to have each of our panelists talk about why that's not true. Why can the Olympic Games still cause displacement despite what the bid committee says? Anybody who wants to take that?
Y'all scared? I'm not scared. So I think, first of all, how's everybody doing? This is a really light crowd. It's really dark room. How's everybody doing this evening? I think to me it's important, a couple of things important. So I'm with an organization called the LA Community Action Network, right? Community organization, really about the business of building an organization that embodies the will and spirit of its constituents across Los Angeles, right? Folks who are oftentimes and usually the oppressed. And I know we're going to have another conversation tonight about policing and the Olympics, but it's important to draw the intersections, right, to housing and policing and the Olympics. I think for me, I'm just going to spend a little time to tell a quick story. So, 1984, I grew up around the corner from here on Exposition and Western. And during that time, I could remember the Batarang. I could remember the straight up banishment of black bodies from communities all across the east side and the west side. And when I said this looks like a light room, I was going to test y'all. Because I was going to say things like, they went through Harlem, they went through Clanton, they went through the 20s, they went through the 30s, but then I would be telling you the names of the tribes of who were in those communities that they targeted, and they said they targeted our communities in the name of public safety. But it was in the name of removing black bodies so those who would come and visit the Olympics could not see us, right? I can recall during the 80s when Mayor Tom Bradley would come on television and talk about the tens of thousands of jobs, right, that were gonna come to South Central Los Angeles that would sort of mitigate the impacts of deindustrialization. And we knew that was bullshit, but that was sort of the mainstream media's way of saying this is opportunity, hope, and promise, and not banishment. The reality was very different, very different. Communities were under siege. People fled their communities, right, trying to find higher ground. Later in the days, I figured out that houseless people during that time were bussed out of the city, so they would be out of sight, out of mind. When I think about 2028, and I think about the connection to gentrification, the primary announcement that there was going to be an Olympics in Los Angeles would prove to be an accelerant to gentrification around the areas in which the games would be played. And so when we think about around the sports arena, when we think about Carson, when we think about speculation, the actual announcement, right? We don't have to wait until 2028. It's going to cause the banishment, not displacement. When we talk about displacement, excuse me, I had gum in my mouth. When we talk about displacement, in most thinking, if you're displaced, you maybe probably have somewhere else to go. But when you're looking at massive gentrification across this country, you're not talking about displacement. You're talking about banishment from communities. Banishment from communities where our families have been for hundreds of years. And so this is why I'm sitting here. This is why I'm saying no to the Olympics and giving you a bird's eye view of what '84 looked like.
Thank you, Pete. That was awesome. Does anybody else have any thoughts on this particular question, or do we want to look at one of the other issues that we're talking about? Or?
Can't be better said than Pete White. But I think it's important to build off of Pete's points in terms of the accelerant that the announcement of the 2028 Olympics has, and just understand together how that works. Of course, with the announcement, you have a couple of things that take place. In terms of the mechanisms and the functions of gentrification and displacement. You have land speculators who immediately gobble up properties and take them off of the market, and those are both perhaps vacant land, if you will, and also land that is housing folks, and they hold that until the right moment. They manipulate the market until the right moment to sell those properties at highest value at the expense of the community, often displacing people in the process. Meanwhile, landlords who are already owners of property where tenants are living, they are immediately seeking opportunities to raise rents as quickly as possible. Wherever there is the need to remove tenants, they find creative and often illegal ways to evict tenants so that they can, especially in the case of rent-controlled RSO units, can increase those rents to as high as they would like. Similarly, those units can be used for short-term rentals, Airbnb, which is a big conversation around town these days. And so we start to see the intersection of these issues, how short-term rentals, of how, the state monsters that we should name very clearly, the Ellis Act and Costa-Hawkins Act, have destructive and really a killing effect on communities. And so I think we can't talk about the Olympics and gentrification without naming those as clear targets to our resistance. I think there's a lot to talk about. I think, Pete mentioned the connection between gentrification and militarization. And I think sometimes we think visually about when there's a new development project, or in this case, Olympic sites and venues as being the epicenter, and then the explosion that goes outward around the community in terms of the gentrifying effect. You can see on top of that the layer of a militarized zone that pushes folks out, pushes people of color, black folks, the homeless out. And so you have layers upon layers of tidal waves, that spill over into the community. So I think it's useful to have some of those visual effects and thinking about, how the mechanisms work as we continue our conversation.
I'm an historian, so I know next to nothing about contemporary housing, and that's why I'm glad I'm here with Pete and y'all, because y'all can handle the contemporary shit. I look at housing prior to Watts in South Los Angeles, and so, but the themes around increased surveillance and policing, displacement and banishment, all of those themes are exactly, I have nothing to add in terms of the themes. But when they're talking this bullshit about around infrastructure, if there's no construction, then you won't have displacement. So there's a few concerns that I would have as an historian, just looking at some corollaries. One is the city, whatever kind of municipal government you always have, when they already have an authority to do things like health inspections, building codes and stuff like that, usually you don't have enough inspectors. So it's people are out here living and making do with the housing that they have, whether they built it on their own, whether they're in a tent, whether they're living in a garage, wherever they're living, they're making do in that space. And granted, it probably does need some improvements, but the city really doesn't give a shit right now because those people don't matter, and so there's an equilibrium that happens between the authority to do something and actually doing shit. So when you have a whole bunch of capital come into somewhere, whether it's government money or private capital, the city's gonna get real frisky when it comes to inspections. So we have things like building codes, folks that are living in garages, folks that are living on the street. These are the type of problems. These things will cause evictions, either formal evictions or informal evictions, so that's going to bring a lot of police presence. So thinking about surveillance from that perspective, what other authority does the city have to displace and evict people? And it's going to pull that card when it gets the chance to do it. And trust that they will, especially if there's money involved in it. Also, public health and safety. So those terms, we've seen those used before in terms of mass incarceration and other forms of eviction. That's going to be the banner under which all this shit happens. They did it in the past. They do it, especially around World War II. That was the main thing. They would just call some shit a slum, shit all of East LA, and then they go and they bulldoze it to the ground. Shit might not get bulldozed down, but people will sure in hell get evicted. You see what I'm saying? So that's one form of surveillance that I would want folks to look at. All you government folks, start looking into that shit. Find out who that inspector is. And if you gotta fuck with them, fuck with them. But whatever you gotta do. So there's that issue. The other thing is infrastructure upgrades. I found a case during the Depression. African American owned a house. He was a laborer, but he was out of work for a couple of years during the Depression. And basically what happened was New Deal dollars came into the city and they did upgrades to infrastructure the way that they should. But hey, what happens? Tax assessments. Now your taxes go up. He bought the house for $2,500 in 1927. He was getting evicted out of the house for about $65 in unpaid tax assessments. Some developer bought his house, some speculator bought his house, and then he sent the marshals to go and evict him, and he shot both those marshals. He had a 1-hour shootout with the cops. He took 5, and they dragged him out of the house. And a small kind of community thing happened in terms of, but that's something else you have to think about too. So even if they don't build new stuff, if they start upgrading stuff and start increasing the prices of housing, you may be a homeowner that's working class, doesn't mean you balling. And if the taxes on your place go up, then you're gonna get evicted that way. So that's something else that I would say. And then also ecology changes. We know, folks that have lived in South Central, there's ways that folks interact with their space. If you live in South Central, having a loud ass party or something like that is cool. Whatever, you do your thing. You having a birthday party at Quinceañera, you do your thing. Nobody's gonna call the cops because you're neighbors. But when you bring in something like the Olympics, when you bring in an outside presence that messes up that ecology, then the way that folks interact with space and the way that they're expected to act in the space is going to change. And then that's also going to cause problems around surveillance. So if in the neighborhood, when I was growing up, we had a cat living in a garage, and he used to pay us money to bring him crates and cans and stuff like that, and the kids was like, "This is dope." But then when, around, it was like close to 2000, white folks started to show up in our neighborhood. And you can't have people living in the garages when white folks are around. So when you start having those type of outside ecological changes, all those little fine-tuned bits of things where laws are being broken, and laws are being broken everywhere. But all those kind of little fine-tuned ways, those equilibriums that communities have, that's what the Olympics will upset. So those are some other surveillance things that as an historian, that I would ask people to look at with the Olympics.
Thank you very much. We do have a few questions from the audience. Does anybody on the panel have any quick remarks that they want to put forward before I get to a couple of these questions? Pretty cool. One real fast, I just want to feel this one myself because I know the answer to it. Someone wrote that they read that they're not going to be building dormitories for the athletes and that they're going to be housing them at the dorms at USC. And that is true to some extent. The plan for the bid committee right now is to not build dormitories for athletes or for journalists. The plan is to house athletes at UCLA and house journalists at USC. But again, I emphasize that's the plan. They are not beholden to that plan by any stretch of the imagination. That's their plan to save money. But the bid is different from what they actually do. Oftentimes, Olympic bids happen and they don't follow through on the promises of that. I wanted to ask this question to the panel. How will the projected improvements in public transit related to the games impact displacement and gentrification? I think this can be a good question for Damien to answer.
Good evening, everyone, again. My organization, the Crenshaw Subway Coalition, has been involved in transit justice work going back to Fix Expo for about 10 years. And what we've seen in many respects is it's been an effort to try and make sure that as these transit lines are built, that appropriate mitigation is being made in communities of color. You will see very disparate impacts of the same project, literally the same project as it goes through a white community versus a black and brown community. And the engagement that I have had in our organizations have with Metro has shown two things. One, they're not a transportation agency, they're a construction agency. They're more of a real estate agency if you want to be real about it. And it should surprise no one that the places that have the highest level of displacement and rent increases are around transit lines. They're around the transit stations. This is not something that was unpredictable. During the conversation about this forever tax that was passed in November 2016 about coalitions that were led by SAJE tried to go to Metro, given the fact that this crisis of housing affordability around transit stations and transit corridors. They went to Metro to try and just get a small piece of the larger budget, the $120 billion over 40 years budget, dedicated toward protecting the existing residents, advancing tenant education, tenant controls. And there have been many conversations that we've had individually that have never really led to policy about how do you make sure that when you're building these transit lines that the appropriate tenant protections are in place before you even begin building. We're seeing this along the Crenshaw corridor right now. The three of the four hottest real estate environments that exist in all of Los Angeles are on the Crenshaw corridor. Crenshaw, Baldwin Hills, Hyde Park, Leimert Park. And so if you see transit in the context of real estate speculation, and I can get into a long explanation, which I won't into right tonight, about why they're building street-level projects in the middle of the traffic capital of the country, when it's really just about making sure they have transit stations and they get density bonuses and bigger projects so they can bring in luxury housing. I can get into a long conversation about that, and there's plenty of documentation to it. But what we are seeing, though, in general in our processes in dealing with Metro, is historically this agency just does not care about its existing riders who are overwhelmingly low income and are people of color. They only care about serving interests that cater to their real estate goal. So when we talk about the UCLA USC piece, and this was one of the things that we put out a long time ago, back in a year ago, we said this Measure M is about the Olympics. Because you can't have a viable transportation plan in the Olympics if the athletes' village is not connected to the center, right? And they didn't have enough money to build the purple line all the way to UCLA. So they had to borrow, as they will do, or ask for advances on it, as they have now that they have Measure M. Called it from the get, and it wasn't even a month after Measure M was passed that they said this would help our Olympic bid. And so what does that mean? Well, in the context of this term called transit-dependent riders, who are the low-income, the people who have to take transit, right? Low-income, seniors, disabled. We're regularly seeing projects and the needs of those being pushed back to promote these luxury projects that advance real estate speculation. So it's not as though some of these projects are not necessarily worthy, but there are a series of projects, a series of needs that existing transit riders have that will not be addressed by this bid, by any stretch of imagination. And what we'll see, and it's already taking place, is further, as we talk about, there are already being crises that exist in the city of Los Angeles, second most corrupt city in the United States. I guess Chicago really is a lot worse, but I think we might have a run for them right now. But we're going to see already these crises exacerbated, right? The police brutality crisis, the housing affordability crisis, the gentrification crisis. And so this transit crisis, whereby this agency is already focused, as it is right now, in catering to the needs and real estate speculation and construction needs versus the needs of its riders who depend on the system every day, going to increase. We already see reductions in transit service that are kind of inexplicable. The service that you and I take, the buses, all the push gold-plated projects. I mean, they're building a light rail line to Ontario Airport, folks. Do you know how crazy that is when I tell that to anybody else? But it's about the real estate around the transit stations. It's got absolutely nothing to do with transit ridership or transit need. So I'm going to stop there. We can get to more of that.
It would have been really awesome if Damien could have talked about that for a minute at City Council. Unfortunately, that was not in the cards.
Take the mic.
That was awesome. There's a lot of great questions from the audience. We're not going to be able to get to all of them during this panel, but as many of these as we can try to answer afterwards online. We want to keep this conversation going. I wanted to ask Nancy Popp from the LA Tenants Union something particular about displacement with regards to the Rio Games. This is something that you know a good deal about, and I'd love to hear a little bit about that from historical context.
Good evening. This is a beautiful space. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, this panel, amazing panel. I'm hearing a lot of reverb on this shit that's going down here in LA based on what I saw in Rio, right? There's identical situations that happened when the development in Baja de Tijuca became, the core center of the Olympic Village and the Athletes Village. Issues with public transportation lines, the buses that the communities there were asking for, the bus lines and the regular transit lines, they didn't get those. They got a special BRT, right, which is a high-speed bus line that was running out from the center of Old Rio out to Baja de Tijuca, right to the Olympic Village. It wasn't for them. It wasn't for them at all. It was for white, wealthy tourists coming in for the Olympics. It wasn't for the community that was living there. Similar issues with displacement. We see the whole issue of, in the tenants union, we're seeing how we've been doing a lot of work with HSID lately, the Housing and Community Investment Department, and pressuring them and really putting them on the spot in terms of calling out a lot of shit that they're doing in illegal Ellis Act evictions. They're actually evicting people who don't even have active Ellis permits going on. They're just evicting them even if their Ellis's aren't approved by the city yet. Like HSID hasn't even approved them, but they're going ahead and evicting them anyway. We're seeing them not enforce code. We're seeing them go after buildings where there's, there's not a lot of issues in terms of the local community, but there's issues in terms of real estate speculation. That they're in hot areas that are targeted by the city for development. So HSID is completely complicit in how it's utilizing Ellis and other methods of displacement to get people out of these neighborhoods. So it's not, there's nothing new. I mean, we're seeing the same thing here that we saw in Rio, we saw in Beijing with massive amounts of displacement there. And this is something that the Olympics do when they're brought into a city. The Olympics are about international investment and speculation. It's not about any kind of build-up. And I remember '84. I was a kid, but I remember it. So it's crazy. It's crazy how they use it as this way to reshape the entire city. And it's not a city for the people who live there. It's a city for investment. The area Baja de Tijuca that I'm talking about, where the Olympic Village was in Rio, there was a fishing village. It was a completely forested ecological preserve that was then redeveloped over a period of 40 years. So it was a conscious, very strategic decision to build the Olympic Village there to further the development of that neighborhood. And we're looking at the same thing here. We're looking at the same thing along the LA River corridor. We're looking at the same thing in the Arts District. We're looking at the same thing in Boyle Heights. They're targeting these neighborhoods, and they have been for a while, and the Olympics are just going to be this impetus to attract more international investment dollars to just push that over the edge, right? And I mean, I was at the City Hall vote. I was at City Hall for the City Council vote the other day. It was just disgusting. The language was absolutely horrifying. This is how it works. This is how white dominance and, frankly, white racism works in government. This is what it looks like in government. They're doing it. So, we have a duty to come together to resist this.
That last comment about resistance is a perfect transition to the first question, second question from the audience that I'd like to have the panelists address. What kind of loopholes and unfair incentives are open to developers and landlords in conjunction with the games? And then as a second part to that, what can we do to resist developers exploiting these loopholes? I know some of the panelists have already talked about some of the things that we're pretty aware of, things like the Ellis Act, things like Costa-Hawkins Rental Housing Act. These are all things that if you're not super familiar with, anybody in a NOlympics shirt can tell you more. But yeah, if you could just kind of talk about some of the incentives and these loopholes that developers are going to exploit. And how can we stop that?
I'm going to first touch on a point I think was around one of the big talking points for the LA Bid Committee was that there isn't a need to develop new venues in Los Angeles. Therefore, there will be no displacement and no impacts on communities. And already we've talked about how the spillover effect, impacts communities. But you better be clear that what's being built right now in Inglewood, the Rams Stadium, is also about the Olympics, where the Clippers are proposing an arena that would potentially use eminent domain to displace 2,000 renters and homeowners and many businesses, is about the Olympics. And of course we know that Dodger Stadium has a long history with Chavez Ravine, and we sometimes forget in recent memory that where Staples Center and LA Live now stands was a community, were families living there, were people who called that home and called that their place to stay. So these stadiums are being developed for the Olympics. They are in place and have a long, bloody history around displacement and banishment. This week, University of Southern California, USC, is celebrating their grand opening of the University Village. And as folks know, several Olympic sites will be on USC's campus. They have the Galen Center. They have a 99-year lease to operate the Olympics, or the Coliseum. And they definitely stand to profit from the Olympics. But where the University Village now stands, the second University Village, historically the university was able to impose its power on the city to use eminent domain to displace black families and black-owned businesses in a thriving community to then build the first version of University Village, which stood for, what, 40-some years after that first displacement in the 1960s, or I wouldn't say the first displacement, but that displacement. And when they raised that University Village, they displaced a couple dozen businesses who would have never received any sort of recognition or compensation if it wasn't for community organizing around those businesses. And today, many folks know Little Bill's Bike Shop is in a battle around their displacement, one of the few remaining black-owned businesses in the community, and is now being pushed out by a non-compete clause by a new bike shop at University Village. And so when we talk about the history of black erasure, we have to look at how these institutions like universities are playing into that and how they now stand to benefit from events like the Olympics. One last point on, and I'm not answering the question, I apologize. One last point on the location of venues I think is really important is if you look at where rent control exists, it doesn't exist in many places, and it certainly does not exist in the city of Long Beach, which has, I think, 4 or 5 Olympic venues slated for it. It does not exist in Inglewood, where we've already discussed where they're planning to have Olympic venues at. And so communities that are going to be impacted are really standing at great risk because even, places like the city of LA that does have rent control and just cause eviction, you see how well that's working out. You know that it's really going to fare very poorly for folks living in other areas. So just wanted to make a couple of those points.
So I think it's, you can't engage in this work, the work of the people at the station and the people in this room and not see a pattern, right? Not see the way in which our elected officials, the corporations, even the influential philanthropic organizations direct their attention towards certain things and not others. So it would be a mistake to not see these Olympics as part of a broader private and public sector strategy of pushing out low-income people who are disproportionately black and brown out of the urban core. And it's not even like exclusive to Los Angeles, unfortunately. This is a global problem, right? And if you see it in that context, I can't even think of the number of ways that they will incentivize and create loopholes to do what they have already been doing in the name of the Olympics over the next 11 years. You have seen them regularly, and I actually made this statement to the mayor, I'll say it publicly. I said, imagine if all that attention and energy flying to Europe, and we got numbers, the man has like been spending over 50% of his time not being the mayor of LA, which I guess given the way he wants to govern is not necessarily a bad thing, but imagine if all that attention had gone to, I don't know, solving homelessness, right? If the ingenuity that went in the financial projections for this actually went into, directing that department into making sure people don't sleep on the street at night. People can afford their rent. And so when you listen to it, when you understand what they're saying about wanting to become a world city and an envy of the world, and you look at what's taking place in every major urban area in the global north, and you look at what they've been doing day by day, you can't even think of the number of loopholes and incentives that will be done. I was 2 years old during the '84 Olympics, and I know the stories of them rounding up folk and pushing people out. And we know that the protections don't currently exist today in a variety of ways. So we got to rise up, folk, and we need to call people to the table right now. If they're going to say that this is, he really said this to me, that this is going to help us focus in on the homeless problem. I guess because he'll want them all off the street by 2028, right? Sure. If they're going to say that this is supposed to be a good thing for all these other things, then then make them prove it now, right? Make them prove it now.
So I think a couple of things. When I think about Los Angeles, if you talk to folks across the country, Los Angeles is known as a progressive place, a progressive city, right? And Damien mentioned earlier that we're like number 2 and first runner-up next to Chicago in terms of corruption. But if we go back to why Los Angeles can be considered a progressive place, it's because of the community organizing that has happened, that has led to very progressive policies on the books. But I think the frustrating part about the very progressive policies on the books are that we failed in implementation, right? And so we have passed, as progressive people and as organizations fighting on the ground, we have passed tremendous shit. But our ability to sustain and to implement those things have failed, right? We have got to think about, right, when we're thinking about the strategies moving forward, not just being a progressive city in name only, but the type of resistance that it's going to take to hold folks accountable, right? We sit around and we let the mayor of Los Angeles and council members who look like us sell us a bill of goods, right? We should say, when they say the Olympics is going to brighten your neighborhoods, we should say, fuck you, right? We should say the Olympics are going to bring jobs. We should say, fuck you, right? They're not. When they say Olympics are going to benefit everyone in your community, and we're just going to make it safe, we should say, screw you, right? We should never entertain the thoughts, because we're talking about it's a remix. We're on repeat, right? These things are happening across the globe. They've happened twice here. They're happening twice now. We should be able to say at this moment, that does not apply for us. These are investment vehicles for the 1% and other folks. That is not for us. And we should not allow these folks to come into our churches, our organizations, and into our neighborhoods and not have to be held accountable, right? And so it's on us. It's not on them, right? It's on us. What are we prepared to do to keep this investment that's going to lead to the banishment of all of our communities and black bodies in particular? What are we going to do against that? Are we going to sit here and talk about it, or are we going to be about it? Becomes the question.
I think that's an awesome and fantastic place to leave this panel. We could honestly have all of you talk for another 2 hours tonight. We really appreciate your time on this particular panel. I think we're going to have to move on to the next bit. A quick bit of housekeeping before we do that. If you have a chair next to you that is not reserved, raise your hand. And then people who are over on the sides, if you want to have a seat, please come over and fill in these seats over next to the folks who don't have anyone sitting next to them. So let's give another big round of applause for this panel. Thank you all so much.